The Agony of Power by Jean Baudrillard. Read by Stеaдyй Делта. Part 1. From Domination to Hegemony. In order to grasp how globalization and global antagonism works, we should distinguish carefully between domination and hegemony. One could say that hegemony is the ultimate stage of domination and its terminal phase. Domination is characterized by the master-slave relation, which is still a dual relation with potential alienation, a relationship of force and conflicts. It has a violent history of oppression and liberation. There are the dominators and the dominated. It remains a symbolic relationship. Everything changes with the emancipation of the slave and the internalization of the master by the emancipated slave. Hegemony begins here in the disappearance of the dual, personal, antagonistic domination for the sake of integral reality, the reality of networks, of the virtual and total exchange, where there are no longer dominators or dominated. Indeed, it could be said that hegemony brings domination to an end. We, emancipated workers, internalize the global order and its operational setup, of which we are the hostages, far more than the slaves. Consensus, be it voluntary or involuntary, replaces traditional servitude, which still belongs to the symbolic register of domination. Hegemon means the one who commands, orders, leads, and governs, and not the one who dominates and exploits. This brings us back to the literal meaning of the word cybernetic. Kubernetica, the art of governing. Contrary to domination, a hegemony of world power is no longer a dual, personal, or real form of domination, but the domination of networks, of calculation, and integral exchange. Domination can be overthrown from the outside. Hegemony can only be inverted or reversed from the inside. Two different, almost contrary paradigms. The paradigm of revolution, transgression, subversion, domination, and the paradigm of inversion, reversion, and auto-liquidation, hegemony. They are almost exclusive of each other because the mechanisms of revolution, of anti-domination as history demonstrated, can become the impetus or the vector for hegemony. We could compare hegemony to the brain, which is its biological equivalent. Like the brain, which subordinates every other function, the central computer assumes the hegemonic hold of a global power and can therefore serve as an image of our present political situation. What other feature distinguishes hegemony from pure and simple domination is the coming of a fundamental event, simulacra and simulation. Hegemony works through general masquerade. It relies on the excessive use of every sign and obscenity, the way it mocks its own values and challenges the rest of the world by its cynicism or carnivalization. Classical historical domination imposed a system of positive values, displaying as well as defending these values. Contemporary hegemony, on the other hand, relies on a symbolic liquidation of every possible value. The terms simulacrum, simulation, and virtual summarize this liquidation, in which every signification is eliminated in its own sign, and the profusion of signs parodies a by now unobtainable reality. This is the total masquerade in which domination itself is engulfed. Power is only the parody of the signs of power, just as war is only the parody of signs of war, including technology. masquerade of war, masquerade of power. We can therefore speak of the hegemony of masquerade and the masquerade of hegemony. All meaning is abolished in its own sign, and the profusion of signs parodies a now undiscoverable reality. Domination and hegemony are separated by the liquidation of reality, the superfast eruption of late of a global principle of simulation, a global hold by the virtual. Globalization is the hegemony of a global power and can only occur in the framework of the virtual and the networks, with the homogeneity that comes from signs emptied of their substance. The entire Western masquerade relies on the cannibalization of reality by signs, or of a culture by itself. I use cannibalize here in the derivative sense of cannibalizing a car, using it as spare parts. Cannibalizing a culture as we do it today means tinkering with its values like spare parts, inasmuch as the entire system is out of order. This distinction between domination and hegemony is crucial. It determines the forms of resistance appropriate for each and the various ways in which the present situation could evolve. One doesn't respond to hegemony and domination in the same way. The strategies should not be confused. In the face of this hegemony, the work of the negative, the work of critical thought, of the relationship of forces against oppression, or of radical subjectivity against alienation, all this has virtually become obsolete. It has become obvious that, thanks to the twists and turns of cynical reason, or the ruses of history, this new hegemonic configuration, which is no longer the hegemony of capital, has absorbed the negative. Negativity as a way of regaining the initiative. Caught in a vast Stockholm syndrome, the alienated, the oppressed, and the colonized are siding with the system that holds them hostage. They are now annexed, in the literal sense, prisoners of the nexus, of the network, connected for better or worse. Power has ransacked all of the strategies of simulation, parody, irony, and self-mockery, leaving the left with only a phantom of the truth. The famous slogan for the Banque Nationale de Paris, BNP, in the late 70s comes to mind. Your money interests me. This statement encapsulates the ignominy of capital far better than any critical analysis. Denouncing capital and all of the banking mechanisms was nothing new. The scandalous feature was that the banker himself had said it. Truth coming out of the mouth of evil. It wasn't a denunciation, a critical analysis. It came from the dominant power and enjoyed complete immunity. It could admit its crime in broad daylight. The most recent profession of faith in a similar vein came from Patrick Lelay, CEO of TF1, the French television channel. Let's be realistic. The job of TF1 is to help Coca-Cola sell its products. For an advertising campaign to work properly, the viewer's brains have to be accessible. The goal of our programs is to make them available by entertaining them, relaxing them between two messages. What we sell to Coca-Cola is relaxed brains time. Nothing is harder than getting them to open up. We should pay our respect to this amazing admission and professional cynicism. It is widely shared, as the following slogan for Post-Telecom testifies. Money has no sex, but it will reproduce. And it could be condemned for the same reason, as it was by all fine minds. But this is not the real problem. Even those who condemned Lelay's shocking statement were fascinated by its insolence. Doesn't this shameless flippancy manifest a greater freedom than the stonewalling of critical contestation? But this is the question. How could truth be lifted by an arrogant discourse that gets the upper hand, by short-circuiting any critique. Technocratic cynicism is not scandalous per se, but by the way it breaks a fundamental rule of our social and political game: corruption for some, and protesting evil for others. If the corrupt have no respect for this protocol, and show their hand without sparing us their hypocrisy, then the ritual mechanism of denunciation goes haywire. The privilege of telling the truth eludes our grasp, in the face of capital unveiled by the capitalists, even. In fact, Lallet takes away the only power we had left. He steals our denunciation. This is the real scandal. Otherwise, how could you explain the general outrage when he revealed an open secret? Instead of denouncing evil from the position of the good, eternal moral position, he expresses evil from the position of evil. It is the best way to say it, but it remains inadmissible. Truth must be on the side of the good. There can be no intelligence on the side of evil. Yet all those who outdo themselves with arrogance, Le Pen, cynicism, Lallet, pornography, Abu Ghraib, mythomania, Marie L., unmask the truth of the system in their abuse of it. The effects are both fascinating and revolting, and they are much more effective than conventional critiques. A bitter truth: radicalness is on the side of the intelligence of evil. Critical intelligence no longer measures up to the collapse of reality and to the passage into total reality. The truth, or the inhumanity of this situation, can only be revealed from the inside, voluntarily or involuntarily, by the agents of the embezzlement of reality. Only evil can speak evil now. Evil is a ventriloquist. Critical intelligence is left to jump over its own shadow. Even in its radicalness, it remains pious and denunciatory. The curse of critical discourse is to reconcile itself secretly with those it criticizes by denouncing them. And I am well aware that what I am saying here belongs to this discourse. Denunciation will never have the shocking frankness of an unscrupulous discourse. We must look to the side of evil for the clearest indications, the harshest reality. Only those who show no concern for contradiction or critical consideration in their acts and discourse can, by this very means, shed full light, without remorse or ambiguity, on the absurd and extravagant character of the state of things through the play of objective irony. What is happening to critical thought, the thought of the Enlightenment and the Revolution, the thought that drove the analysis of capital, merchandise, and spectacle throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, is what happened before to religious, ethnic, and linguistic phenomena. We are presently witnessing their formal renewal, but without any of their original substance. The religious revival is epigonal and has nothing to do with the fervor of past centuries. It presupposes the dilution of faith as symbolic organization, the disappearance of transcendence, and maybe even the death of God. It is the specific product of a disenchanted situation, of loss where everything that disappears is artificially revived. It is the abreactive product of a world where there is no reason left to believe in anything. Current critical thought continues along its trajectory, but it is no longer the critical thought of the Enlightenment and modernity, which had their own object and their own energy. It is merely an epiphenomenon of a world where there is nothing left to analyze in the hopes of subverting it. This thought is no longer current because we are no longer in a critical situation, like the historical domination of capital. We have entered a hegemonic form of total reality, of closed-circuit global power that has even captured the negative. All that is left today is the specific product of this posthumous situation, where it no longer has a historical reason to exist, or any effectiveness, Yet it is all the more prominent. The critique of alienation and spectacle has blossomed and spread to the point that it has become the most common vulgate, because it is the only discourse of consolation that we have. But its tone has changed. It has become more melancholy as subversion and transgression have lost popularity today. Three simultaneous dimensions form the passage from domination to hegemony. It is a perilous triple jump, a three-part sacrifice. 1. Capital surpasses itself and turns against itself in the sacrifice of value, the economic illusion. 2. Power turns against itself in the sacrifice of representation, the democratic illusion. 3. The entire system turns against itself in the sacrifice of reality, the metaphysical illusion. All three jump over their shadow. The shadow of capital is value. The shadow of power is representation. The shadow of the system is reality. They respectively move beyond value, representation, and reality in a hyperspace that is no longer economic, political, or real, but rather the hegemonic sphere. Capital is both the total realization of value and its liquidation. Power is now the final form of representation. It only represents itself. The system is the total version of the real, and at the same time, its liquidation through the virtual. This is the hegemonic form. The economic illusion. In any event, the question of capital must be reconfigured. Does something like capital still exist? And if there is a crisis, what is the essence of this crisis? We must try to pass through the looking glass, beyond the mirror of production. Does exploitation still exist? Can we still talk about alienation? Have we become the hostages? Not the slaves, but the hostages of a global market under the definitive sign of globalization? But can we still talk of a market? And hasn't capitalism reached the point of destroying the conditions of its own existence? One of the problems of generalized exchange is that the market is both its ideal and its strategic location. It may be the fatal destiny of capital to go to the limit of exchange, to the total consumption of reality. In its historical and Marxist definition, capitalism presided over the multiplication of exchanges in the name of value. The market obeys the law of value and equivalency. The limit here is the limit of classic capitalism. And the crisis of capital can always be resolved by regulating value. This is no longer true for the financial flows and international speculation that far surpass the laws of the market. Can we still speak of capital? Do we keep the term and the concept and therefore acknowledge the exponential strategy that pushes capital beyond its own limits into a whirlwind of exchanges, where capital loses its very essence, which is the essence of the market, and self-destructs in an unbridled circulation that brings the very concept of exchange to an end? Or do we consider that it is no longer capital at all, but something radically different, an exchange that is not only general but total, completely freed from value and markets, an exchange that, having lost its rational principle, the principle of value, becomes integral, just as reality, having lost its reality principle, becomes integral reality, from which there is no salvation? In this light, capital in its historical form appears to be a lesser evil. In relation to a virtual universe, reality appears to be a lesser evil. In view of hegemony, domination itself appears to be a lesser evil. Take the example of the web, the internet, networks, blogs, etc. It is all free, liberally deployed without economic constraints, beyond markets in a frenzy of total communication. This is a virtual catastrophe, the catastrophe of total exchange. that is not even protected by money or the market. We find ourselves wanting it all to be subject to the law of value, taken in hand by capitalist power, to slow its exponential development, to escape the ecstasy of free, secular, and obligatory communication, because it is leading to the dictatorship of forced exchange. But no one will escape. The next stage, which can be seen in these mysteriously free networks, is much worse than anything that was stigmatized as the mercantilization of exchange, where everything is assigned a price and a market. This influence, which is not strictly speaking the influence of a person, a capitalist's power, or any political power, is the ascendancy of total, integral free exchange, universal wiring, universal connection, capital markets, surplus value, merchandise, and prices seem like a lesser evil, or protection against something worse. This is the virtual dimension of hegemony. It is different from the domination of capital, and different from the dimension of power in its strictly political definition. The democratic illusion. One might wonder, however, if hegemony is a direct continuation or perpetuation of domination. Is it the same form deployed to its ultimate consequences? Or is there a moment where there is a shift to a non-critical form, beyond internal crises but not exempt from internal catastrophe or self-dissolution through saturation, like any system at the limit of its possibilities? A world of total, instantaneous, perpetual communication is unthinkable and, in any case, intolerable. Hegemony corresponds to a phase of the saturation of power, political, financial, military, and even cultural power, pushed by its own logic, but unable to accomplish its possibilities fully. A dire fate indeed, the story of an umbrella, maybe the dire fate of realizing possibilities fully, is the fate of humankind? Yet any action that tries to slow capital or power, that tries to keep them from accomplishing all of their possibilities in their last hope, their last chance to survive, just short of their end. And if we let them, they will rush headlong to their end, taking us with them. Is it better to let them do it, to let them follow their fatal penchant for self-destruction through saturation and ultra-realization? Or is it better to slow them down to avoid disaster? This is the paradox we confront in the paroxysm of power. And once again, the same global, universal problem faces humanity and its hypertelic fate when it rushes to its end because it is too successful, technologically, sexually, demographically, etc. It all depends on your idea of power. If you presuppose that intelligence or the imagination hold power, then the persistence of stupidity, or at least the permanent absence of imagination from power, is inexplicable, unless you also suppose a general disposition among people to delegate their sovereignty to the most inoffensive, least imaginative of their fellow citizens. A malin genier that pushes people to elect the most nearsighted, corrupt person out of a secret delight in seeing the stupidity and corruption of those in power. Especially in times of trouble, people will vote massively for the candidate who does not ask them to think. It is a silent conjuration analogous to the political sphere, to the conspiracy of art in another domain. We should abandon the democratic illusion of imagination or intelligence in power that comes from the depths of Enlightenment ideology. The naive utopias of the 1960s must be revised. Imagination in power. Take your dreams for reality. No limits to pleasure. All of these slogans were realized or hyper-realized in the development of the system. If we remove the moral utopia of power as it should be in the eyes of those who reject it, if we hypothesize that power only lives through parody or simulations of representation and is defined by the society that manipulates it, If we accept the hypothesis that power is an ectoplasmic, yet indispensable function, then people like Bush or Schwarzenegger fill their roles perfectly. Not that a country or a people has the leaders it deserves, but that the leaders are an emanation of global power. The political structure of the United States is in direct correlation to its global domination. Bush leads the United States in the same way as those who exercise global hegemony over the rest of the planet. We could even say that the hegemony of global power resembles the absolute privilege of the human species over all others. There is therefore no reason to think of an alternative. Power itself must be abolished, and not solely in the refusal to be dominated, which is at the heart of all traditional struggles, but also just as violently in the refusal to dominate. If the refusal to dominate had the same violence and the same energy as the refusal to be dominated, the dream of revolution would have disappeared long ago. Intelligence can never be in power, because intelligence consists of this double refusal. If I could think that there were a few people without any power in the world, then I would know that all is not lost. Elias Canetti. The metaphysical illusion. The reabsorption of critical negativity is echoed by an even more radical form of denial, the denial of reality. In simulation, you move beyond true and false through parody, masquerade, derision, to form an immense enterprise of deterrence. Deterrence from every historical reference, from all reality in the passage into signs. This strategy of destabilization, of discrediting, of divestment from reality in the form of parody, mockery, or masquerade becomes the very principle of government, is also a depreciation of all value. The question is no longer of a power or a political power, connected to a history, to forms of representation, to contradictions, and a critical alternative. Representation has lost its principle, and the democratic illusion is complete, not as much by the violation of rights as by the simulation of values, general uncertainty, and the derealization of all reality. Everyone is caught in the signs of power that occupy the entire space, and that are shared by everyone communally. Take, for example, the resigned, embarrassed complicity in the rigged workings of the political sphere, and polls. From there, the system works exponentially, not starting from value, but from liquidation of value, not through representation, but through the liquidation of representation, not from reality, but from the liquidation of reality. Everything in the name of which domination was exercised is terminated, sacrificed, which should logically lead to the end of domination. This is indeed the case, but for the sake of hegemony. The system doesn't care a fig for laws. It unleashes deregulation in every domain. Deregulation of value in speculation. Deregulation of representation in the various forms of manipulation and parallel networks. Deregulation of reality through information, the media, and virtual reality. From that point on, total immunity. One can no longer counter the system in the name of one's own principles, since the system has abolished them. The end of all critical negativity, closure of every account and all history. The reign of hegemony. On the contrary, since it is no longer regulated by representation or its own concept or the image of itself, the system succumbs to the final temptation. It becomes hypersensitive to its final conditions and casts itself beyond its own end, according to the inflexible decrease of the rates of reality. The most serious of all forms of self-denial, not only economically or politically, but metaphysically, is the denial of reality. This immense enterprise of deterrence from every historical reference, this strategy of discrediting, of divesting from reality in the form of parody, mockery, or masquerade, becomes the very principle of government, the new strategy, and it truly is a mutation, is the self-immolation of value, of every system of value, of self-denial, indifferentiation, rejection, and nullity as the triumphant command. Moreover, the concept of the universal is the specific product within the human race of a certain civilization called Western, and within that culture of a privileged minority, a modern intelligentsia, that has dedicated itself to the philosophical and technical edification of humanity. But what can this concept mean, not only outside the human race? It is irrelevant for the animal, plant, or cosmic realms, the inhuman in general, but also in the major cultures other than our own, archaic, traditional, or Eastern, or Far Eastern, that do not even have a term for it, or even in our own societies outside the civilized and cultivated classes, where humanism and universal principles have become hereditary. What does the universal mean in the eyes of immigrants, populations left fallow, entire zones of fracture and exclusion in our own overdeveloped societies, and even in the privileged fringe, the high-tech globality? What does the universal mean for all the corporate people, all the high-performance groups or individuals, according to both a global and increasingly corporate, isolationist, protectionist evolution? Contrary to what Immanuel Kant said, the starry sky laughs at this universal law, but so does the heart of humankind. Not only living beings, but the vast majority of humans never obeyed it, and those who claim to obey it happily put their singular passions before any other ideal finality. This is no doubt, despite the concept, a more authentic way to be human. Do they themselves believe in this ideal finality? No one knows. The only sure thing is that they claim to make others obey. The Discourse of the Universal describes a tautological spiral. It is held by the species that considers itself superior to all others, and within this species by a minority that considers itself the holder of moral and universal ends, forming a veritable democratic feudality. Whatever the case may be, there is a major inconsistency with continuing to use a discourse of the universal and a discourse of reference when it has no meaning or effect anywhere, neither with global power, nor in opposition to it. To relativize our concept of the universal with the increasing globalization of the world, discrimination becomes more ferocious. The cartography should not confuse these zones beyond reality with those that still give signs of reality in the same hegemonic system of globalization, even though they do not function in the same way. We could even say that the gap separating them is growing, and something that was only a cultural singularity in a non-unified world becomes real discrimination in a globalized universe. The more the world is globalized, the worse the discrimination. The two universes, the hyperreal and the infrareal, seem to interpenetrate, but are light years away from each other. The deepest misery and enclaves of luxury coexist in the same geographic space. Take, for example, the oil condominiums in Saudi Arabia and the favelas of Rio. But these are extreme cases. In fact, the entire planet is organized on the principle of definitive discrimination between two universes, which no longer have any knowledge of each other. Global power keeps its integral control over the other world and has all the means necessary for its extermination. It is the tear in the universal. As for the consequences of this tear, the upheaval it can create, we have no idea except for what is already present today, although it is only the beginning. The only response to this increasingly violent discrimination is an equally violent form, terrorism, an extreme reaction to this situation of impossible exchange. Which leads us to Europe in its current form. Europe is a non-event. It was first an idea, maybe starting in the Middle Ages, a reality before an idea. Now it is no longer an idea or a reality, but a virtual reality referring to a model of simulation to which it must adapt. From the perspective of projection at any price, the will of the people is an obstacle, or at least an indifferent parameter, or an alibi. The yes vote comes from on high, and we can now see that the people are Europe's skeleton in the closet. This virtual Europe is a caricature of global power. It wants to find its niche in the world order, to represent an economic power that rivals the ridiculous image of its American big brother. Europe is organized according to the same liberal principles and order. Europe is organized according to the same liberal principles, and other than a few last gasps of sentimental socialism, is aligned with the model of flux and global deregulation. It is incapable of inventing a new rule for the game, which is also the struggle of the left on the national level. Without its own political structure or historical reason, Europe can only desire expansion and proliferation into the void through indefinite democratic annexation, just like global power. Of course, all of the peripheral countries want to join this byproduct of globalization, just as Europeans dream of reaching the global level. Europeans have the same relationship to American global power as other countries, like Turkey, for example, have to Europe. Turkey's entry into Europe, outside any political considerations, may be revealing in terms of this paradox. Europeans, from birth, are not really modern either. They have not truly entered hypermodernity. They are, in fact, resisting it. And in every country, there is something that resists generalized exchange, the vertigo of universal exchange. Is it good or bad? Does Europe have to be resolutely modern? Should it resist the grasp of hegemony while being its best accomplice? Turkey wanting to enter Europe is not the least of the paradoxes at a time when France is giving signs of wanting to leave. The sudden rise of the no vote during the referendum was significant in this regard. It is the best example of a vital or visceral reaction in defense against the consensual blackmail of the yes against the referendum's ultimatum in disguise. There is no need to have a political conscience to have this reflex. It is the automatic rekindling of negativity in the face of excessive positivity. To the coalition of divine Europe, the Europe of good conscience, the one on the right side of universality, with all others cast into the shadows of history. The forces of good were completely wrong about the perverse effects of an excess of good and the unconscious lucidity that tells us to never side with those who are already right. A good example of a response to hegemony that is not the work of the negative or the result of critical thought, the political reasons of the no are no better than those of the yes. It is a response in the form of a pure and simple challenge to the saturation of the system, the implementation, once again beyond political considerations, of a principle of reversion, of reversibility against the hegemonic principle, a good example of the parallax of evil. We have here the profile of the new type of confrontation characterizing the era of hegemony. It is not a class struggle or a fight for liberation on the global level, since the liberation of exchange and democracy, which were the counterpoint to domination, are the strategies of hegemony. Take, for example, England's presence in Zanzibar. By freeing the slaves in the late 19th century, England was able to take control of East Africa. It is an irreducibility and irreducible antagonism to the global principle of generalized exchange. In other words, a confrontation that is no longer precisely political, but metaphysical and symbolic in the strong sense. It is a confrontation, a divide that exists not only at the heart of the dominant power, but at the heart of our individual existence.